The next beginning does not wait for the Alps. It is on the far side of the Western Sea, at Gades, where the old Phoenician world touched the Atlantic and the Carthaginians still had a foothold after Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica had slipped away. A ship from Africa comes in under late sun. Men unload equipment, stores, perhaps elephants, perhaps coin, perhaps the first hard pieces of a policy that cannot yet be called revenge, because it has to become recovery first. Hamilcar Barca had come west in 237 BC with the memory of defeat behind him. The First Punic War had ended at sea. The mercenary war had nearly destroyed Carthage at home. Rome had taken Sardinia and Corsica, while Carthage was weak enough to yield. The old island system was broken, and a city that had lived by maritime reach now had to ask where power could still be rebuilt. Spain answered that question in a language Carthage understood: ports, silver, soldiers, markets, and distance from Roman control. There is a famous story of Hamilcar taking his young son Hannibal to an altar before the Spanish expedition and making him swear hostility to Rome. The story matters because ancient writers remembered it and later generations loved it. It is vivid, theatrical, and easy to paint, but if it becomes the explanation, the history becomes too small. An oath does not mine silver. An oath does not recruit Iberian cavalry, found a harbor capital, pay indemnities, or build a veteran army. Livy begins the war with that emotional frame: Roman anger at a defeated enemy's attack, Carthaginian bitterness at a conqueror's grasping power, and Hamilcar's pride wounded by Sicily, Sardinia, and the added tribute. Lazenby adds the necessary break. Even if the oath story came from Hannibal himself, it was told in exile to Antiochus, when Hannibal needed to prove that he had never ceased to be Rome's enemy. The story is evidence for memory and self-presentation, not permission to turn the whole war into a childhood curse. The oath belongs in the room, but it cannot own the room, because the larger story is harder and better. Carthage had been beaten, fined, narrowed, and humiliated. Hamilcar did not go to Spain only because he hated Rome. He went because Carthage needed a new material base, and because the Western Peninsula offered something Sicily no longer could: a place where a Carthaginian commander might turn local politics, mineral wealth, and military talent into power before Rome could close the door. Spain was not empty space waiting for a Carthaginian plan. It had old coastal settlements, older trade routes, Greek and Phoenician contacts, inland peoples with their own rivalries, and communities that made decisions for themselves. Gades gave Hamilcar an opening, but it did not give him a country. The peninsula was politically divided. Iberians, Celtiberians, Lusitanians, Cantabrians, Galicians, and many smaller communities lived in a world where local kings, towns, and coalitions could choose war, alliance, neutrality, or defection. That fragmentation made conquest possible but not simple. A Punic army could use one rivalry against another. It could recruit men from one group while fighting the next. It could punish a coalition, spare survivors, and then enroll them. Yet every success had to be repeated, translated, secured, and made profitable. Hamilcar's first Spanish project ran through the south. From Gades he operated in the lower and middle Baetis Valley, the country of the modern Guadalquivir. The geography mattered because the valley connected coast, interior, agriculture, and mines. The richest target was not glory on a map, but ore in the hills, silver and copper around Rio Tinto, and probably the mineral zones of Sierra Morena beyond. Metal changed the scale of the project because Spanish wealth could move in several directions at once. It could be minted into coin. It could pay soldiers. It could attract mercenaries who trusted hard silver more than promises made after a lost war. It could quiet political enemies in Carthage by giving them a share in revenue. It could help pay obligations to Rome sooner than a weakened Carthage might otherwise have managed. In a city recently shaken by unpaid armies, reliable money was more than economics. It was political oxygen. The mines also linked labor and violence, or had to be extracted, guarded, transporting, and turned into usable wealth. Freeman gives the most vivid account of shafts, water, washing, guarded convoys, and local coinage, while Steinby keeps the frame steadier by tying the evidence to Gadia's high-quality silver issues and the reported flow of horses, weapons, soldiers, and money back to Africa. The exact machinery matters less than the pattern. Carthage had found a place where conquest could become revenue and revenue could become command. Ports made that pattern possible because coastal access kept the interior connected. Hamilcar could rely on Phoenician towns along the coast and use them as allies, supply points, and contacts between Africa and the peninsula. Land operations in a new country still needed ships behind them, not necessarily grand battle fleets like the ones lost in the First Punic War, but enough maritime support to move equipment, maintain links, and make Spain more than a stranded inland adventure. The Barcid project was therefore not a turn away from the sea. It was a way of finding new land power through coastal access Carthage still understood. Hamilcar's campaigns in the interior were harsh. He fought anti-Punic coalitions, used local allies, and took survivors into his army. He was not trying to empty Spain. He needed Spain populated, productive, taxable, and recruitable. The same hand could punish and enroll. That mixture would become characteristic of the Barcid project. Coercion when resistance threatened the system, generosity when loyalty could enlarge it, and a constant search for soldiers who could be made useful under Punic officers. The army that grew in Spain was different from the force that had nearly destroyed Carthage after the First Punic War. It still contained hired and allied troops, and its loyalty was still personal, material, and fragile. But it was now being formed through repeated campaigns under familiar commanders. Men learned how Hamilcar fought. Officers learned the country. Units hardened together. A new military culture formed around the Barcid household, and that culture was useful to Carthage even when it made Carthage uneasy. That unease is the key to naming it properly. Some writers have described Barcid Spain almost as a private kingdom. The phrase catches something real: family command, long tenure, personal loyalty, and distance from the slow politics of Carthage. But it can mislead if it detaches Spain completely from the state that benefited from it. Steinby pushes against that overstatement. Goldsworthy holds the difficulty open. The safest term is Barcid command, a family-led system, unusually autonomous, deeply personal, materially useful to Carthage, and never quite reducible to either loyal provincial service or independent monarchy. Lazenby helps hold that balance. Carthaginian generals could receive task-specific commands without Rome's annual turnover, and that gave commanders such as Hamilcar and Hannibal room to build policy across years rather than months. It also made the aristocracy at home suspicious of successful soldiers far away. Yet the same evidence makes a clean private kingdom story too neat. Hannibal's later command was not simply an army's whim. Polybius, as Lazenby reads him, has the people's confirmation at Carthage following the soldiers' choice in Spain. Suspicion and support existed together. Carthage had made a Spanish instrument and then had to live with the hand that held it. The difference matters because the Second Punic War did not grow from one man's temper alone. It grew from a recovery machine that Carthage needed and could not entirely control. Hamilcar did not live to see the system reach its finished form. He died while campaigning near Hellas, in the hinterland of Acralus, after years of pushing Punic power east and inland. The details of the end are uncertain, but the consequence is clear. Command in Spain did not return neatly to Carthage for redistribution. The army and Carthaginian elements in Spain acclaimed Hasdrubal, Hamilcar's son-in-law. Carthage then ratified the choice. The sequence matters because power had already developed two centers of gravity. One was the formal state in Africa. The other was the army and command structure in Spain. A general could not rule Spain without recognition from home, but home also had to reckon with the men, officers, money, and local ties already gathered around the Barcid household. Hasdrubal's rule changed the texture of the project. Hamilcar had been the soldier founder, carving room through campaign, punishment, and alliance. Hasdrubal was still capable of force, and he avenged Hamilcar's death against the Orissi, but later accounts remember him especially for consolidation. He married the daughter of an Iberian prince. He used diplomacy, alliance, and public forms of leadership that local elites and the wider Hellenistic world could recognize. Hannibal served under him as cavalry commander, which matters because the future invader of Italy learned not only battle, but the management of a mixed army inside a negotiated landscape. If Hamilcar had opened the mine roads, Hasdrubal built the capital that made those roads visible. Livy gives Hasdrubal that same political texture, even through a Roman lens. He remembers a commander who extended Carthaginian power by cultivating local princes and winning the support of peoples under their influence. That does not make the Spanish project gentle. It makes it legible. Force could seize ground, but diplomacy made ground governable. The capital that made the system visible was New Carthage. The site was not chosen because the name sounded grand. It was chosen because geography did work. New Carthage stood on the site of earlier Mascia, on a peninsula with sea access to the west and south, a strong natural harbor facing southward, hills around it, and a route inland towards silver. Grant describes it as commanding one of the finest harbors in the world, with a lagoon protecting it from the interior and a valley giving access to the mining country. Steinby adds the internal theatre of the place. 4 hills, a western hill with Hasdrubal's palace, and a name that made a claim before a word of diplomacy was spoken. New Carthage meant more than another city. In Punic, Carthage itself was the new city. Hasdrubal's foundation repeated that name in Spain, advertising renewed Carthaginian power after defeat. It was a harbor, arsenal, treasury, palace, hostage center, administrative base, and symbol. Ships could connect it to Africa. Roads and valleys could connect it to mines and inland communities. Soldiers could gather there. Envoys could be received there. Wealth could be stored there before it moved. Hostages could be held there as political insurance, binding allied and subject communities to the new order while reminding them that Barcid friendship had weight behind it. The city also shifted the center of the Spanish project away from old Gades. Gades remained ancient, valuable, and symbolically deep, but New Carthage was more central to the Mediterranean coast and closer to the mining networks Hasdrubal needed. It looked both inland and seaward. It allowed Spain to become not simply a collection of campaigns, but a system with a face. The visible face of the Spanish command mattered to Rome. Roman observers did not need a perfect intelligence service to see the change. Traders, Mycelian contacts, Greek ports such as Emporii, and Roman envoys could all carry fragments of the picture. Hamilcar had built in Spain. Hasdrubal had founded a new capital. Silver was moving, soldiers were gathering, and the family that had fought Rome so stubbornly in Sicily now commanded a widening western base. By the time New Carthage stood above its harbor, the question was no longer whether Carthage had recovered some strength. The question was what kind of strength it was becoming. Rome was not asleep while the Spanish base expanded. It is easy to imagine the Romans looking only inward while Hamilcar and Hasdrubal quietly built Spain into a Punic base. The truth is more interesting. Rome was busy but not blind. It had problems in northern Italy. It had Gallic pressure on the frontier. It had Illyrian problems across the Adriatic. It had new island commands to absorb. These distractions mattered, but they did not amount to ignorance. Spanish expansion was noticed early enough for Roman envoys to appear before the outbreak crisis. An envoy was sent to Hamilcar in 231 BC to ask what his Spanish operations meant. The answer, in later tradition, turned recovery into reassurance. Carthage needed Spanish resources to pay what it owed. Whether the answer was sincere, evasive, or both, it shows the diplomatic language available to Hamilcar. Spain could be presented not as a threat to Rome, but as the means by which Carthage fulfilled the settlement Rome had imposed. New Carthage made that argument harder to ignore. The Romans later sent an envoy to meet Hasdrubal there, not merely to Carthage in Africa. That choice says something. Power had become visible in Spain, and Rome addressed the commander who held it. The result was the Ebro Agreement of 226 BC. It barred the Carthaginians from crossing the Ebro in arms. On a schoolroom map, it can look like a clean line, as if two powers calmly divided Spain with a ruler. It was not that simple. Steinby follows the interpretation that the treaty was primarily military, limiting Punic armed movement rather than creating a full reciprocal division of spheres. Commercial and diplomatic activity could continue north of the river. Goldsworthy adds the harder political point. The restriction bound Carthage, while placing no equivalent restriction on Rome. Livy's version is cleaner and therefore more dangerous if used alone. He makes the Ebro a boundary between spheres and adds Saguntum as a neutral buffer. The later crisis at Saguntum belongs to the next flashback chapter, but the wording matters here because it shows how Roman memory turned a military line into a moral frame. Modern reconstruction has to keep the line less tidy. The agreement limited Carthaginian movement, but it did not settle every question a town south of the river might raise. The Ebro line also belonged to a Roman fear larger than Spain itself. Rome was facing Celtic pressure in the north. A Carthaginian army in Spain and Gallic forces beyond the Pyrenees did not have to be allied for the possibility to matter. A boundary at the Ebro created distance between Spanish Carthaginians and northern Gauls. If Punic forces moved through that zone, Rome might have warning. If they remained south, Rome could fight its Gallic war without imagining Hamilcar's successors coming through the back of the storm. The Roman deployments during the Gallic crisis show the anxiety in another form. Forces were placed where they could answer threats in northern Italy, but reserves also sat in places such as Tarentum and Sicily, old doors through which a Punic move might appear. No Carthaginian attack came, and the evidence does not prove a Barcid naval plan. It shows Rome learning to think of Carthaginian recovery as a problem that could connect theaters. Spain, Gaul, Sicily, Sardinia, Africa, Italy, and the sea roads between them. The agreement therefore recognized and restricted Punic strength at the same time. It acknowledged that much of Spain south of the river was effectively Carthaginian or Barcid ground. It also asserted that Rome could impose limits on the defeated rival whenever Roman security required it. Carthage had lost the sea war, but Spain had rebuilt enough power to require negotiation. Rome had won the sea war, but still needed a line on land. That unstable combination would not stay quiet forever. For the moment, though, it held. Rome fought in the north. Hasdrubal consolidated in Spain. New Carthage grew into the working center of the Western project. Mines kept producing. The army kept hardening. The treaty left a line, and like many political lines, it looked clearer before anyone tried to use it. It did not answer what Rome would do with friends or clients south of the Ebro. It did not answer how Carthage would define armed movement, local dispute, or protection of allies. It created a framework, but not peace deep enough to survive ambition. In autumn 221 BC, Hasdrubal was murdered. By then, the Barcid project had outlived its founder and survived one succession. Carthaginian power in Spain reached over a vast territory, perhaps almost half the peninsula in the broadest reckoning, and exceeded the scale of Punic territory at home. Around New Carthage and Sierra Morena, mineral wealth continued to be exploited. Family members held high positions. Hasdrubal and Mago, Hannibal's brothers, were part of the command structure. Other relatives and associates tied Spain back to Carthage. The question was not whether Spain mattered. It mattered too much for the succession to be ordinary. Hannibal was 25. He had come to Spain as a child, grown up inside his father's campaigns, served under Hasdrubal, and commanded cavalry. The soldiers knew him not as a distant aristocrat arriving from Africa with a seal of office, but as a commander formed in the same Spanish theater that had formed them. When Hasdrubal was killed, the troops in Spain chose Hannibal. Carthage ratified the decision. Livy makes the personal recognition vivid. The old soldiers see Hamilcar in the young man, the same force in the face, the same fire in the eyes. That is literature, but it is useful literature because it tells us what kind of legitimacy the army was supposed to recognize. Hannibal was not only appointed, he was remembered into command. Again, the sequence matters. It was not simply a coup by an army, and it was not simply an appointment by a distant government. It was Barcid command working as it had come to work, legitimacy from the men in Spain, formal confirmation from the state in Carthage, and a political reality that neither side could ignore. Opposition existed inside Carthage as the Spanish command grew. Later tradition preserves fear at Carthage that the Barcid family had gathered something like royal power. That fear was not absurd. Spain had made the family wealthy, militarily indispensable, and personally bound to an army. But Carthage also needed what Spain provided. The city that had once struggled to pay evacuated mercenaries now had a Spanish system producing silver, soldiers, and strategic depth. The oath story returns here, but in its proper size. A boy at an altar may have promised never to submit to Rome, or later writers may have sharpened that memory into eternal hatred. Either way, the adult Hannibal did not inherit only a vow. He inherited new Carthage, mines, coinage, Iberian and Celtiberian networks, seasoned officers, a family command structure, and an army that had just chosen him. The inheritance was therefore institutional as much as personal. The danger Rome would soon face was not hatred alone, and not a family legend alone. It was rebuilt Carthaginian power in Spain, held in a young commander's hands, with enough wealth to pay, enough soldiers to move, and enough autonomy to make decisions before distant politicians could soften them. At the harbor of New Carthage, the water is quiet. The palace looks down from the hill. Mine roads run inland. Envoys have come and gone. Somewhere beyond the Ebro, Rome has drawn a line. South of it, Hannibal has inherited the machine his father and brother-in-law built, and the machine is ready to move.